You're live. Welcome. Hello, everyone. This is Advocating with Evidence, Policies for Doing Research in Civil Society. This is a panel, a public panel, hosted by the Center for Democracy and Technology, Data and Society, and the ACLU. And I'm Jordan Kramer. I'll be moderating. And I'm going to briefly introduce our wonderful speakers today. And just so you have a sense of the format, I have some questions for them. There'll be time, about 15 minutes at the end, 10 or 15 minutes, for you all to ask questions, both folks here in the room and also folks on Zoom. So please hold any questions for the end. So just to begin, as I said, I'm Jordan Kramer, and I'm an anthropologist of society and technology with a particular interest in bridging research and policy, and particularly around issues of community mobilization and tech justice. And next to me is Alice Marwick, Director of Research at Data and Society. And she's a qualitative social scientist who researches the social, political, and cultural implications of popular social media technologies. Her most recent book was The Private is Political, Networked Privacy on Social Media, which examines the network nature of online, how the network nature of online privacy disproportionately impacts members of marginalized communities. And she's currently writing her third book on online radicalization with support of an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship. Next to Alice is Dhanaraj Thakur, the research director here at the Center for Democracy and Technology. Dhanaraj leads research at CDT on advancing human rights and civil liberties online. And over the last 15 years, he's designed and led research projects that have significantly informed tech policy solutions and helped improve the way that public policy problems are framed. And his work has also been cited in many publications, including the New York Times, Wired, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, The Guardian, and others. And then seated next to Dhanaraj is Marissa Gerchik, who is a data science manager and algorithmic justice specialist at the ACLU. Marissa is a data scientist and researcher focused on questions at the intersection of machine learning and public policy. And her work focuses on the civil rights implications of AI and automated systems, including supporting ACLU's litigation, advocacy, and public education around artificial intelligence in various domains. So I'm really pleased to welcome these three speakers today, and I'm also really grateful for the support of CDT, Data and Society, and the ACLU to host this really important conversation on the experiences of doing research in civil society around issues of tech and justice. So to get us started, one of the main challenges for researchers in civil society is how to develop high quality research that also advances our organization's priorities. But often the timelines that are available and the resources can limit the scope of research. Key questions in policy and advocacy are also challenging to answer, right? They often require these longer timelines. So I'd like to start by asking each of you if you could share an example of what you think of as a successful research project that helped advance your organization's work, and particularly if you could share what you think made the project successful. I'm going to start with you, Alice.
Sure. Thanks, Jordan. So I have been director of research at Data and Society for about a year. And before that, I was a professor of communication at UNC Chapel Hill. But I started at Data and Society as a fellow in 2016, 2017. And while I was there, I wrote a report called Media Manipulation and Disinformation Online with Becca Lewis, who's now a professor at MIT. She was a grad student when we met. And that has been one of my most successful projects ever in terms of it has 2,200 citations. I still get asked to speak about it. It was one of the first major qualitative reports on far-right disinformation, how it disseminates through the media ecosystem. So by those sort of metrics, it was very successful. It kicked off a stream of media manipulation work, which still gets cited today and which I'm very proud of. But did it do anything to change the landscape around disinformation and dissemination of far-right ideas? I don't think it did. I think it increased our understanding of that. But so that's one thing. I think it depends how we define success, right? Another example is the work that Data and Society did over a period of about 5 years on algorithmic impact assessments as a way of assessing algorithmic harm caused by algorithm, AI, and automated systems. And that wasn't a single paper, right? I think we have this fantasy sometimes that you're going to put out this blockbuster report, it's going to be on the cover of the New York Times, and all of a sudden some policy is going to be passed, and it's going to be all because of you. I don't think that really happens. But in this case, what happened was we had a series of researchers and postdocs who worked with Data and Society on different projects, people like Andrew Selbst, Madeline Eilish, Jake Metcalf, Tamara Neese, Meg Young, who worked on different aspects of defining what an algorithmic impact assessment would look like and how it would work and how it would be integrated as part of a regulatory landscape, culminating in our AIM lab, which did participatory impact assessments with impacted communities, which just launched its big final package last week, if you want to go look at it. And I think that was successful in that what it really culminated in was Biden's executive order on AI, where algorithmic impact assessments were a sort of crucial part of measuring harm. And we were extremely proud of that. And then there was an administration change, right? So on one hand, that is exactly the kind of success we want to see, right? We do research on a governance mechanism or a regulatory mechanism. We sort of work out how it might work, not just theoretically, but practically. We test it out with impacted communities and it makes it into the policy landscape. And that's all well and good, but as we know, the policy landscape can radically change. So I think what we see as success is a lot of different things. Is it launching careers for some of our researchers who go on and spread our sort of socio-technical way of doing research? Is it getting cited by academics? Is it getting press hits? Is it making it into, court decisions or law review articles? But that process, I think, can be very different for every report, and something that doesn't seem like it's successful when it first comes out can have a very interesting half-life, because these things can last a long time. All right.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Jordan. Thanks, Alice. So this is Dhanaraj. So I wanted to maybe provide an example, a much more recent example that looks at these issues of success, maybe in a slightly different way. Whereas I completely agree with how we think of success in terms of publications and research outputs may depend on media citations, media coverage with citations and others. We did a recent project that looked at the issue of content moderation, which many of us are concerned about the process of content moderation, the process of how that works within social media companies, and how that is applied in what's called low resource languages for which there's data available to train many of the generative AI models that we are now familiar with. So these are languages, particularly in the global south, that may have tens of millions or hundreds of millions of speakers, but may not be prominent in terms of resourcefulness in the way that European languages might. And so in embarking on that project, one of the things that came out and it recently concluded was that whenever we presented this work, and we've been presenting the results of this project on many different venues here and around the world, is that we get this kind of feedback from many different communities that this is amazing work for them, because they are really glad to see that there's an investment in this kind of evidence building, which can help them, activists and others in these various communities around the world, particularly linguistic activists and people that are concerned about the way the implications of LLMs for their own languages, and given the context of language erasure and so on, colonization and so on over many years. So having this kind of evidence base about what implications are for content moderation systems for social media companies to employ large language models and other kinds of automated tools for content analysis, what are the implications for how they use languages becomes very important for them. And so that kind of feedback is another indicator of success, in addition to the many others that we've mentioned. I think that is one way that is encouraging to me to see when we do this kind of work that can support advocates or inform work with advocacy, not just here and within our own organizations, but with other organizations around the world. So how did we get there? I think it's also important to know that we did not just embark on this project just out of the blue. It's a result of a combination of several years of work that CDT has been engaged in, and many others around like content moderation processes and the system of content moderation, if you will. So I'm not just talking about the analysis or detection of an individual piece of user-generated content, but how policies are defined, enforced, appeals, processes, and so on. So CT has published a lot of that, and we've been thinking a lot about that, along with many others. So we're building upon that concern, as well as a lot of recent work we've done around the issue of resource languages and how claims of many companies that produce AI LLMs or other kinds of generative AI models about the multilingual capabilities of these models and how they can be global in nature should be critically assessed. And that's part of what we're trying to do with this project. I think another reason if I'm defining this project successful, another reason behind it is that this also involved lots of like consultations. So again, in developing the idea around this project, we had lots of consultations with many partners around the world over a period of several months to say, does this make sense? How could we use this? What could be the utility of it? Does the research or design make sense? And so on. So there's this long period of consultation. And then I think another aspect of this is now that we've done this, is that many new doors have opened up in terms of like opportunities for other research, yes, but also other kinds of partnerships, other kinds of organizations who we typically do not engage with or know interested in this kind of work. So yeah, I think that's some example going back to help answer your question, Charlie.
Hi, this is Marissa from ACLU. To say a little bit more about my work and the role of research within my work, I'm part of the ACLU's technology team, which is a group of data scientists, software engineers, product managers, analytics engineers, and social science researchers who support the ACLU's work by providing technology expertise across a number of areas. Most relevant to this conversation today, part of my work includes publishing and presenting original academic research and interdisciplinary research focused on the impacts of AI and automated systems, artificial intelligence and automated systems, often at places like the ACM Conference on Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency, or FACT. And this work is often in collaboration with ACLU's legal teams and policy teams, and also with our Director of Research, Emily Graytack, who sort of oversees policy research within the ACLU as a whole across sort of all of our issue areas. To give an example of a recent research project, one project that we worked on was earlier this year, a team published a research paper at the ACM FACT conference focused on a new law in New York City called Local Law 144. That's one of the first laws regulating the use of AI in employment around the country. And what this law does is, one of the things it does is essentially says that employers who use certain types of algorithms in the hiring process have to have independent bias audits conducted of those tools. And what those bias audits have to do, sort of in part responding to the evidence and research showing the ways that these types of systems can exacerbate discrimination and bias, often existing discrimination and bias in the hiring process. This law says that employers have to have independent bias audits conducted of those tools. And what those bias audits have to include is statistics and some information about how the tools work, and also information about how people in different race and sex groups fare in the hiring process when those tools are used. And so when this law first took effect in 2023, we were seeing headlines saying things to the effect of, these audits require employers to show that their tools are bias-free or free from racism and sexism, sort of big sweeping claims about what the audits show. And we were seeing this risk essentially based on our analysis anecdotally of the audits. The audits did not seem to support that claim at all. So we're seeing this risk that this auditing law and these audits could potentially be used to legitimize possibly discriminatory systems. And so what we did in this study was we went through this extensive process of just first finding all of these audits, cataloging them, understanding them, analyzing them, using a mixed method approach, essentially auditing the audits. And found that the audits had a number of issues. Essentially, we argued that even audits produced in sort of full alignment with the law were incomplete evaluations of bias, and so they couldn't support this claim that these tools are bias-free. It just wasn't sufficient to look at that. And we summarized the lessons that the audits provided and provided a set of recommendations for similar auditing laws that were being considered, and those are being considered around the country. and also made our data set and our analysis code publicly available so that other researchers could sort of use that and build on that. And that was recent work just done earlier this year, completed earlier this year, but we've already seen that the recommendations that we created and the learnings and findings from that project have been useful to ACLU's policy advocates who are working on advocating for stronger protections around algorithmic auditing in similar laws that are being considered around the country. And I think in general, there were a few key elements that made this project successful and that are sort of representative of what successful research looks like for our team. The first, I think, was doing a really thoughtful job of scoping the work and thinking about when does a question that we're thinking about become a research question, and when is that research question meaty enough to become a research project? And also, are we the right people to be doing that work? Are we the right people? Who should we collaborate with? How should we think about that? And I think a big part of what made this particular project successful was that we honed this research question in close collaboration with our legal teams, with our policy advocates who are sort of seeing this law come up in their work, advocating around it to understand where there were gaps in the existing research, and then to think about ways that we could help provide empirical quantitative support to understand and evaluate those types of questions. Also working very closely with the ACLU's network of affiliates around the country. So in this particular project, we work closely with the New York Civil Liberties Union. And I think the last piece that was really important of this collaboration was working with academics and realizing where we could bring our expertise to bear, but also where we could benefit from partnership with academic researchers. And in this particular case, we worked very closely with academic researchers with expertise in algorithm auditing.
Thank you all. This is Jordan. So I think Marissa has raised some of the questions that I want to turn to next, which is that research in civil society often has to be responsive to the news cycle, as well as other external pressures such as fundraising. And sometimes this can make it difficult to sustain longer range or more in-depth inquiry. And so, for example, Marissa, you raised the question of, how do you decide when a question is a research question and when that then should become a research project? So I would love to hear how research that you've conducted in civil society, how you feel like it differs from research in other contexts. And within that, what does research mean at your org? Go around, or if someone particularly wants to start. Go ahead.
This is Alice from Data and Society. We are primarily a qualitative research institute, which differentiates, I think, us from a lot of our peers. And qualitative research can take a long time. We have a history of doing ethnographic projects, which require sort of place-based research. Some of those projects can take over a year just to do the research, and that's before you put out the final report. We are, I think, one of our strengths is that when we are putting out the final version of a report, it's very textural. It has lots of stories. There's things that you can tell. There's things that you can repeat. There's narratives. There's people that you can follow along with. For us, a research question is one not just that's like academically interesting to our researchers, right? Because I think that's the big difference between doing research as an academic in a faculty situation where you can basically do research on, especially once you get tenure, on like anything that you're even slightly interested in. But also, does it have the potential for public impact? Does it have the potential to move the needle on something that is an important social issue around the impact of technology and automation and AI? So one of the things that we tend to do with our projects is we now put out a lot more midpoint findings, like when we are working on a project that has a lot of longevity. Right now we have a really wonderful project on people using general purpose LLMs for mental health support. And that project involved qualitative interviews, it involves a diary study, and it involves focus groups. So it's a 3-stage project. But even after just the first stage, we already had some interesting preliminary research findings. So our researchers have been blogging about them, they've been talking to the press about them. And so we are able to sort of start making policy recommendations or start thinking about the way that we might push the landscape around mental health chatbots, even fairly early in the process, once we have empirical findings that we feel confident we can stand behind. Like, for example, the recent law in Illinois that regulates mental health chatbots does not account for the fact that most people are not using specifically tuned mental health chatbots for support. They're using general purpose LLMs. So just off the bat, that finding was useful to intervening in that policy landscape. But generally, I would say that a research question for us has to be something that we have expertise in, right? Like that we're in our lane, or that we have a partner that we really trust, that we think is appropriate, that it sort of fits our mission, our values. You know, we are always looking, we're always trying to center impacted communities, and has implications. Like, are those implications for advocates? Are the implications for community partners? Are they implications for policy on the local, municipal, state, or federal level? But we also do allow, because we are a research institute first and foremost, we do allow our researchers a certain amount of leeway, because I think that's where the most interesting and innovative projects come from. Like, you cannot predict what project is going to have really impactful findings 6 months or a year down the road. Like, this chatbots project came out of one of my researchers who had seen a bunch of people sharing mental health prompts on TikTok, right? Like, this was a complete, like, this came out of her passion and her personal interest. And a year later, it's in the news all the time. So it worked out really well in that case. So I think there has to be a mix of like a heavy hand of research direction and allowing your researchers to be creative and be innovative and pursue questions that are of real importance to them.
Great. Okay, so this is Anuraj. Yeah, maybe I'll just echo a couple things that Alice and Marissa have said about like research processes. So for us, similarly, we have to consider research questions that are going to have that are going to be able to inform our advocacy work, and I distinguish that between supporting advocacy work. What we're trying to do is like look at evidence that really gets at these like less understood issues, right? Often those questions, however, are not of primary importance to some in academia. I'll give you an example. A couple years ago, we did a research report that looked at the ways in which what are the available like content analysis tools that could be applied to end-to-end encrypted communication systems. So in other words, how could you try to assess content in limited ways without breaking or undermining the privacy guarantees of end-to-end encrypted communication systems, think of like WhatsApp or iMessage or things like that. When we approach like cryptographers and computer scientists and others that were like deeply embedded in these kinds of issues, this was not a question that was coming up. But when we talk to like our policy colleagues here at CDT and among other like advocates working in surveillance policy and so on, this was a very important question. Why? Because law enforcement was often pushing the argument that encrypted systems are essentially undermining their ability to perform like criminal investigations. So here we had a question that was very important for us, but was not being pursued within our academic networks and colleagues. And so we had to work. We brought together several people, and we pursued a project that could highlight ways in which you could do content analysis using various other kinds of methods without actually looking at the content itself, right? And so that, I think, it was a way of like highlighting what kinds of research questions are important to us, but are sometimes not a priority within academic research. And that's the kind of niche that many of us, as you I think this would you all understand, is the kind of niche that we fit in. In terms of what's different more broadly, I would say it's how research is communicated. So a lot of us have training, particular training, methodological training, and so we apply those kinds of skills and methods to the work we do, and obviously in ethical ways, getting RP approval or some kind of ethical review and so on. And we don't necessarily spend a lot of time communicating about the ways how these methods apply in the kind of research outputs that we have. Why? Because often the audiences that we are targeting are not particularly interested in all the deep details of methodological research. So what we do, like for example, the research that we publish at CT is we do present that kind of detail, but often not at the forefront of the report or whatever output it is. However, as you all know, if you go to an academic conference, methods are the question that people often get preoccupied with. And so I've often found this a very different kind of conversation, because we also present papers at academic conferences as well, and so you'll see this kind of the conversation moving in different different directions. I think that is the kind of difference for us as well.
Yeah, I think that's all. This is Marissa. That's all very well said. I think the only thing I'll add is that I think doing research in civil society, the questions are always grounded in impact, and that's because of our colleagues. And for me personally, I think that's one of the most exciting aspects of doing research in civil society is there's no shortage of questions that are high impact to look at, and you can collaborate with and talk closely with your colleagues about how to make that work impactful. I think doing research before I was in civil society, I sometimes felt like I would write a section at the end of a paper and say, I hope this has policy impacts, but I would sort of like not really know how that was going to happen or who was going to make that happen. And now I would say, I know that there are going to be impacts, and I know, there are many different strategies to make it actionable and people who care about reading and acting on the results of that research. And I think that is a unique facet of doing research in civil society.
Yeah, thank you, Marissa. I think that's a really important point. And I want to pick up now on a point that you made, Dhanaraj, about the different audiences for different kinds of research. And so I think that in civil society, research is most often aimed at policymakers, coalition partners, members or constituents, and the press. More so, I think, than towards other research experts, or students. And so, I found, for example, in my own work, that reports got the most traction when we had a really clear plan for public engagement, not just once the report was finished, but that we actually started that planning and thinking in the development stages, sort of as we were developing the research, and then ideally to sort of continue that sort of rollout and engagement after the report comes out. So I wanted to ask each of you, sort of, who do you see as your audience or your audiences? And in particular, how does that audience affect how you present or publish research in terms of format, rollout strategy, and so forth?
Yeah, so this is Alice from Data and Society. So I think you can communicate research, you can communicate the same findings in multiple different ways to different audiences. And I think that's generally the most effective strategy. We do a lot of work on the future of labor. And so a lot of our audiences for that are labor unions and organizers and activists, right? And so what we're trying to do there is we're trying to equip them with evidence and stories that they can use when they're doing collective bargaining or when they're doing advocacy work. And so in that case, you don't necessarily need, an 80-page report with 1 million charts, right? You need like the top line findings, you need some interesting stories, like that's what people can take away and work with. And then you might have a policy brief that goes along with that. That's like much more specific about what the interventions are. And for some of our other projects, we have a climate technology and justice team. And so a lot of our partners in those projects are, climate activists or climate, we work with a lot of people doing activism around data centers right now. So we have a lot of community partners for that. And one of the things they're looking for is they need data on how data centers are affecting communities. So we have a project that's looking at that. So you can tell a story, in an op-ed, you can tell a story in a podcast, you can tell a story in a policy brief or a big report. But I think it's about taking your findings and figuring out how you slice and dice them and how you position them and being able to write in a lot of different idioms. I think that what makes it challenging for people who are academics who want to translate their research is that they often can't write in any other than a high academic idiom, which is really hard for most people without academic training to understand, even if they're really smart and engaged. So being able to write in a more conversational style and a more policy-focused style, I think that is really what makes the difference between whether or not you can reach the audiences that you're hoping to reach, and then also having different networks of dissemination that you can sort of target research or target sort of research findings to.
Yeah, this is Dhanaraj. I completely agree with that. We also try to do this here at CDT to try and figure out who the different audiences are, and try to tailor or communicate the findings and analysis in different ways. It really helps for us anyway to have this comms team that will be like, well, what does this really mean? What are you really trying to say? Can you tell me this? Can you summarize this whole report in like 3 sentences? Yeah. Or some kind of exercise like that, which really just forces you to come with like the elevator pitch of what you're really trying to get at. But we also try to think of different audiences for sure. So in addition to the groups that Alice mentioned, I also mentioned one group that we are also interested in is industry. So whether we're talking about social media companies or the frontier model AI companies and so on. So part of our work then is to come up with research, but then figure out what are recommendations that can be targeted towards them, and it will actually often engage them in various ways, different formats and so on, with these kinds of recommendations. So that's another audience that we think of when we are developing our research outputs. And there are many different formats for sure. One thing, and this is more of a, not so much like based on experience, but more of a question, maybe we can talk about so it's like, how can we take advantage of video more? There's some academics I've seen that are literally on TikTok, like summarizing their entire paper in a really cool, accessible way. Clearly that requires a lot of skill and talent, but it's reaching to, it's presenting or providing our research to a much wider audience than we may normally think of. So yeah.
This is Marissa. I think in general, one of our goals in our work related to AI and automated systems that are used in areas that impact civil rights is to demystify how those systems work. And I think that goes hand in hand oftentimes with research. So thinking creatively about ways that you can communicate your findings to different audiences, as Alice and Donna have mentioned. I think, for instance, when the audience is policymakers, or that might be one of the audiences, the research paper I mentioned earlier, where we were auditing the audits essentially, even though we had a set of recommendations in the research paper, it's sort of this like dense, very tightly packed text research paper, and it's in the last section. And so one thing we did was take those recommendations and turn them into a 2-pager short set of policy recommendations that was written in more accessible language for our policy advocates and sort of policy staff, not just policymakers, but all of the folks who are involved in the sort of policy advocacy process. There was another project that we did a couple years back where we were specifically looking at the use of risk assessments, so pretrial risk assessment algorithms that are used in the criminal legal system to make decisions about whether people are released pre-trial. And one of the audiences that we wanted to help communicate our findings to was advocates, public defenders, and criminal defense attorneys who are sort of interacting with those systems directly and trying to sort of lay bare their policy implications, reveal their biases, and understand how they work on behalf of their clients. And so in addition to the research paper, we put together a resource with questions that those advocates could ask when they were presented with algorithms in those sort of high stakes settings to understand how they work and how they don't work, and who they work for and how they've been tested and what the oversight around them is. And I think that was a useful way to sort of communicate the findings. I think the last piece of this too is I think part of our work is not just communicating the findings of our research, but also communicating the findings of other research that we are aware of that our colleagues may not have on their radars, or maybe have on their radars but don't have time to engage with as substantively. And so I think part of our work is also in those explainers, summarizing and highlighting other research that's important for the public, for our different audiences, for our colleagues internally to know about. And so one example of a place where we leveraged this was a couple years ago. We put together, we also do a lot of work focused on hiring and employment and the use of automated systems in that context. We put together a Know Your Digital Rights resource for job seekers to understand and have some resources to use their privacy and civil rights in the job seeking process when they're interacting with systems online. And part of that was really synthesizing a lot of research, highlighting issues with the sort of systems that are used in those processes and communicating it in a way that was legible in a sort of Know Your Rights format.
Thank you. This is Jordan. And so I think, again, Mercy, you've anticipated the next question, which is about collaboration. So research in civil society often sits between academia, policy or advocacy, and also the intersection of multiple fields as well. But sometimes I have found that in civil society, some disciplinary distinctions get flattened. Even though research methods, data, even sort of what counts as validity varies quite greatly across the social sciences, journalism, law, and other fields that influence our work. And I think, Alice, you alluded to this as well, thinking about how Data and Society approaches research, what ACLU approaches research, and so forth. So I would love to hear more about how you each collaborate with other researchers, both across civil society, but also lots of academic policy centers. So how you have approached that? And in particular, what kind of challenges have you encountered? And how have you navigated these challenges, such as working across disciplines or working, sort of cross-functionally with policy experts?
Sure, I'm happy to start.
Yeah.
This is Marissa. So there's been a number of projects we've worked on recently in direct collaboration with academic researchers. One was the project I've mentioned a couple times about auditing. Another is a project that I just mentioned about pre-trial risk assessments and sort of risk assessments used in high stakes contexts like the criminal legal system, the child welfare system, education. And on that project, we worked in collaboration with researchers at Brown University, and the focus of the project was on this metric that we saw was being used over the course of several years, was frequently being used and pointed to and touted as sort of proof that these algorithms were working well and that they were should be justifiably used in these types of contexts. This metric, which is called area under the curve, or AUC, some folks may be familiar with, was coming up again and again, and it was something that government agencies and vendors who are building these tools would often point to and talk about almost as a way of making the conversation really technical, branding it as technical almost unnecessarily. And ultimately, we were seeing both improper uses of this metric in a statistical sense and also the sort of weaponization of this metric to decide who gets to be in the conversation about these tools and to essentially cast issues about whether these tools should be used as not as technical decisions rather than policy ones that should be, in conversation with advocates and impacted communities. And so this was an area where we were seeing this weaponization of this metric, and we could understand that that was incorrect, and we sort of brought this expertise of seeing how it was being weaponized. But it was also really beneficial to work with academic researchers who could help us state precisely how and why the use of that metric was incorrect and what a better use of that metric would be in a statistical sense. And so we worked, I think in that collaboration, that was a good split that worked in terms of our sort of focus areas and responsibility and learning from each other, was thinking about theoretically how should this metric be used, and then in practice, given the way it's being used, what should change. And I think in general with academic researchers, sometimes the dynamics and timelines and resources can look a little bit different, but there's also a lot to learn from each other. And that's been, I think, a great part of doing research in collaboration.
We want to turn it over to questions in a few minutes. So if you each want to, say something, please go ahead and then.
Sure, I can. This is Donald. I can be brief with this one. So I think we're taking on a case-by-case basis, but many of our research projects involve collaborations with academics, to be honest, because there's often like a niche set of knowledge or expertise or set of skills that we want to bring into the research question or project that we're looking at, whether it's on like child safety, or I mentioned the encryption research that we did as well a couple years ago, or even more. Another good example of this is a project that where we wanted to examine the extent to which women of color political candidates were subject to online abuse and gender disinformation relative to other kinds of political candidates in the previous 2 election cycles. And so there we collaborated with many different researchers, but across many different disciplines as well, which is also very important to the work that we do. I quickly mention that formally we have a non-resident fellows network, and I think maybe Dennis has something like that as well, where it's meant to actually promote this kind of engagement with academics. But we also conduct external peer review with all our research as well, and which is another form of engagement. So in other words, when we are near to completion with research output, we would get that reviewed as well. So those are different forms of ways of doing this kind of engagement.
This is Alice from Data and Society. Thanks, Dhanraj, for giving me the prompt. So we have one of the strengths of Data and Society is our network. We have had in the past, faculty fellow programs and fellowship programs that have brought lots of academics into our midst for a year. We've had a lot of former postdocs who've gone on to faculty positions all over the country. And most of them are still affiliates. Some of them have become advisors. We have academics on our board of directors. So we have I would say that academic collaboration is sort of one of the hallmarks of data and society research. It's really rare for us to have a project that has no academic partners, and some of our projects are deeply enmeshed. So for example, Ranjit Singh, who runs our AI on the Ground program, is currently embedded in different labs at Cornell University, looking at how scientists are using AI and how that is changing scientific knowledge production. And being able to do a very classic sort of STS lab studies project like that would not be possible without our close ties to academic networks that we already have. Earlier this year, I wrote a report on AI and scams with an academic, Lana Swartz, who's a professor at UVA and a friend of mine. And we have sort of mapped out our research agenda on AI and scams, looking at what she can do with her postdocs and what we can do with our resources. So it's very much about what can our organization bring to bear? Like how can we support academics in doing their research? And how can we also amplify the work of academics? Or maybe there's academics who want to come and work for Data and Society for a year so they can sort of learn more about how you do this kind of more public facing work. But we are, like I said, we are a research first organization, right? Like the research is the center of our organization. And so I think without those academic engagements, it would be much more difficult for us to sort of stay up to date on what is going on and sort of map out the landscape, because I think when you're doing work on tech and society, it's pretty much always interdisciplinary, like just intrinsically.
This is Jordan again. Thank you all so much for these really insightful comments. And I want to turn it over now to all of our wonderful attendees. And we'll start with the room. Yeah, who want to put their hands up? I can't read your name tag, so say your name also for the interpreters.
Georgia Bullen from Superbloom Design. I think that I was curious to pick up actually on this academic piece because you mentioned publishing in academic journals, and it's something that we've thought about and not prioritized, and just because it is its own timeline and arc, right? And that I think, I mean, you mentioned collaborating with academics, and it's like, it was my question. What do you see as the most impactful way to do that? Or just like, I think, you know, collaboration is interesting. Academics could lead on that side, like how to structure those partnerships in the ways that they are the most effective and everyone's aligning incentives in a way that works well for them, right? And just ideas you all have about that, I think would be helpful because it's another layer of work, right? In a different communications environment, things like that.
Yeah,
I'm going to restate the question because I think we're on the audience.
Yeah,
probably make it better.
Want to jump in? So this is Jordan. So the question is, what is the most impactful and sort of effective way to carry out academic partnerships, right?
And publishing in the academic sphere, right?
Yeah.
I think the challenge I always think about is like, where are those? Who is being impacted by those papers, right? Is it furthering the academic field? Are people building on it?
Yeah.
How do you enable that, right? That's like there are different purposes for these different.
So particularly in terms of academic publishing and sort of the different incentives there.
This is Alice from Data and Society. We have always encouraged our researchers to publish in academic journals. I think most of our researchers see themselves as academics first and foremost. And many of us have moved in and out of academic positions. So if you want to move from civil society back into academia, if you haven't been publishing in academic journals, that pretty much shuts down that pathway. So I think, but for people who don't care about that, I'm not convinced that academic publications are really worthwhile. I've published in academic publications my entire career, and I still will continue publishing in academic journals, but they are really slow. It can take a minimum a year for an article can come out. I've had articles in peer review for 2 years, 3 years. So I would say they are nice to have, and they should never be the primary way in which you're getting your research out, right? You should have the research out in another format, and then you should use the research paper as a sort of addition. The one thing I will say is picking up on what Marissa said about fact. I think conference papers are a little bit different because the publishing cycle is much shorter, because the people who go to the kind of computer science conferences that we all tend to publish in are a little bit more practical and pragmatic than a social science journal, and because it can be a place where you can get results out fairly quickly. So I would be strategic about whether it's academic journals. And I would be also very careful about ensuring that you're not wasting people's time doing things like publishing in an edited volume that nobody is going to read. I'm being very honest here. Like, it is worse to spend months on something that nobody will read in a book that costs $200 at a handful of academic libraries than writing an op-ed. Like, that's a better use of your time. But if you can get your researchers to publish in like high impact journals, like top journals that people in the field recognize, it can increase the legitimacy of your organization, which can open doors for partnership that I think can be very important.
Thank you. I'm gonna go.
Actually,
do
let's
you have one
take
from
some
the
from the
audience?
Zoom.
Sure.
So one question coming from Leah Mazzulai. I wonder if some of the panelists can reflect some insights from their conversations with funders and foundations. How do funders think about policy impact and the timelines they expect to achieve policy impact, since these processes take time?
Okay, so this is Jordan, and the question is about, can you share some of your conversations with funders, particularly around questions, I think, of impact? That I missed. All right, go ahead.
So this is Dhanaraj. So this is a difficult question and difficult issue. I think how we conceive of impacts will vary. So funders have a whole different kind of agenda and a different audience that they're responding to. They may come up with different kinds of metrics, but often the funders that society is engaged with are not necessarily, it's not NSF. They're not like research-oriented funders who are just, let's produce some edited book or journal papers or whatever over a 2-year period. They're looking for specific kinds of policy impact or other kinds of impacts on communities. Where does research fit into that? That's not an easy thing for people to grasp. I'm not sure if we all can articulate that very well either, but this I often feel is a disconnect that they're like, okay, you're gonna do this research, what is gonna be the concrete impact? The problem with research, as we've discussed, that the impact may take a while to occur. And it may be impactful in different ways. Like when we talk about success at the start of this conversation, we're thinking of it in different ways. Do funders track or recognize or appreciate these different ways? I don't know. I don't think so. But one way I think, which I think there's a kind of intersection in terms of what we think of impact or what funds might think of impact, is in like dissemination of work, right? So you can think of like workshops, maybe something like this, or media or public kinds of outputs. So maybe that's like one, let's say, low-hanging fruit that the researchers can hold on to.
Okay, do we have time for one more or?
There are many questions, so just let me know.
Let's take one more from, I know we have time for one more here.
Great. So Gus Hussein says, hi, my name is Gus from Privacy International London. Thank you for this amazing panel. Can you share any lessons or cautionary tales about research risks and how you mitigate them? Risks of affected communities, risks of lawsuits from companies, breaches of terms of services that are necessary to understand systems, whistleblowers, etc.
All right, so the question, this is Jordan, and the question is about lessons or cautionary tales about research risks, and particularly issues of like, what was it?
Being sued,
or risks to research.
Yes. This is Alice. So I'm just going to outsource this question. I am a member of the Association of Internet Researchers, which is an academic institution, and I'm a member of the AIR Risky Research Working Group. And we put out a major report in the spring that you can find on the AIR website, aoir.org. And it is how risky research for academics and sort of how to prevent some of the risks that Mr. Hussein, Dr. Hussein, whoever, sorry, Gus, mentioned in their question. I think this is very dependent on the kind of research you are doing, right? And I think there's a very different set of questions around like risks to your participants or your impacted communities versus risks to the researcher themselves from potentially hostile communities. And you have to take very different things into account when you're designing a research project, but you really do need to have those risks in mind at the very outset of the research process. But luckily this is a field that other researchers have explored. It doesn't need to be outside of civil society. So there are a lot of great resources like the AIR Risky Research Guide, which can point you in that direction.
I think we, actually think it's probably time for us to maybe wrap up. Do you want to do
Yeah.
one last question?
Let's do
and
one
then
more-
we'll wrap?
one more
All right,
question.
one more.
Can you talk about a research project that you decided not to pursue and why?
The question is, sorry, this is Jordan, and the question is, can you talk about a research project that you decided not to pursue and why? I don't know, Kelly.
I think this is Marissa from ACLU. I think this sort of gets at the question of when a topic that you're thinking about becomes a research question and when a research question becomes a research project, as we were discussing earlier. I think there are often times where issues will come up repeatedly in our work, and we'll sort of look for existing research on that topic and find that there maybe is none. But I think sometimes that means it's something for us to look more closely at and potentially think about pursuing. But I think sometimes it also means recognizing when sort of sharing that question with a partner or an academic research collaborator or someone else who might have more expertise on that particular topic or area, or who might have more resources to be able to do the kind of study that would be needed to explore that question, might make more sense. So for example, some research that we follow very closely is around automated speech recognition systems and the performance of those systems for different groups of speakers. So there's been some research showing that automated speech recognition systems perform worse at recognizing the speech of Black speakers compared to white speakers, of speakers with speech disabilities compared to those without, and of those whose first language is not English compared to those whose first language is English. And we've often seen gaps in that research, but we are not necessarily the right group to be doing new research about that topic. And so sometimes it's more a matter of communicating to the research community, hey, there's a gap on this topic or this area. And I think that's part of why it's so important to have these strong relationships with academic researchers in order to have a close dialogue about those questions.
All right, well, thank you so much. This is Jordan again. I want to thank Marissa and Dhanaraj and Alice for this conversation. I want to thank everybody who attended, all of you on Zoom. Dhanaraj, I want to pass it to you in case you have any other closing comments. This will be available on CBT's YouTube.
Yeah, we're gonna, yes, exactly. This is Dhanaraj. We're gonna make the recording of this webinar available on CBT's YouTube channel, so you can look out for that. But thank you.
All right, so
Thank you. Video.
all right. I know, I don't think I've ever been early to anything. Wait, since we have a minute.